Thank you for the half hour. I believe that after the end of this, you'll think a little bit differently about yourself, about leadership, about the dynamics of it all. I want to start with a quote that sits with me. A writer who's a friend of mine, and I put this at the beginning of my thesis, and he says, I went to the psychiatrist's office, sat down on his couch, told him I was there, and threatened to kill him if he took away my rage. And the idea that rage is something that doesn't have a place unless you're an artist or a child is what I was wrestling with in terms of this thesis, and a way to talk about a journey that started for me a long time ago with my own rage, and the way I've learned to utilize it as a tool in the way I motivate and lead my group. So the title of my thesis is Rage, Grace, and Partners. And this is my thesis statement, quite simply. The relationship between rage and grace is critical to the successful leadership of people, organizations, companies, movements, brands, and even countries. And I want to start with a word about, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take you through definitions of rage and grace and what I mean when I say partners. I'm going to talk a little bit about the model, how it works, and then I'm going to take you through a couple examples and end with a couple thoughts in terms of where to take this, where the thinking goes from here. So my methodology started a long time ago on the therapist's couch at about 2:50 for 45 minutes. And from there I just started to investigate all of the influences. Rather than doing a kind of a survey, I did a deep dive on. I read a lot, and I read back on some things that affected me earlier on. Things like the Fountainhead. I dug deep on rage. I looked at some people who had articulated rage in a really interesting way, whose rage had been a part of their leadership skills. I went back to entertainment. I looked at business organizational models. I looked at influences of leaders who, to me, embodied both rage and grace. Whether it was a form of entertainment, whether it was a declaration of independence, whether it was a piece of art. I thought the interesting thing that this dynamic between Bugs Bunny and Daffy Duck is exactly rage and grace as characters. And what I found was that it wasn't just me, but it was everywhere I looked, this dynamic between rage and grace existed. That the people and the individuals and the companies that I saw as being landmark and successful and contributing and moving things forward in the world had this tension going, that I could identify this tension between rage and between grace. And that's, we see it in music and we see it in a lot of other things, but when you really think about it, it kind of exists everywhere. So I started by trying to define for myself what this was. Also, I did some online surveys, and I did use Facebook. I thought this was the best response I got. Rage is what you feel when your girlfriend Grace cheats on you. So just to begin, I just want to start with a definition of rage, because it's really important to identify what I'm talking about. I'm not talking about anger, and I'm not talking about fury, and I'm not talking about wrath. I'm talking about something very specific. And my definition, which is something that I created for this thesis, is this. Rage is a response or a reaction to an existing condition or action which manifests itself in an intense feeling or emotional experience resulting in expression or action. There's three main components to this definition that are important to note. One, that it's an emotional response. One, that it's a response. Two, that it's an emotional response. And three, that it leads itself into an action. So, what does rage look like? Well, this is what rage looks like. I think we all have some familiar things that we think when I say rage, things come into your head, and it may be this, it may be art, it may be political demonstration. I wanted to play both sides of the table, so Michael, got I don't know who this is. This I thought was this great picture of road rage. I love this banner. I can't believe we still have to protest this crap. But this is the rage that we know, and this is the rage that we all think that rage looks like. But the truth is, rage looks like this. This is rage. This is what happens when you want to go against an existing brown piece of equipment the way that it's always supposed to be served to you. This is rage. This is what happens when you take materials and you reorganize them in a way that hasn't been thought of before because you can't bear to do something that somebody else has done. And this is rage, which I hope is sort of.
Here's a little song for anyone who's there.
I heard you already watched that today, so let's see a second time. Yeah, I mean, it really is a beautiful piece, and it's beautiful because of grace. You have this, you're calling for change, but you're doing it in a way where people can listen, and it's grace that brings in that ability for people to listen. And again, it's just to give you a definition, to level set a little bit. For me, grace is having, showing, or pleasing with a characteristic of kindness, charm, refinement, or decency. And in the thesis, I go into a little bit more depth about the difference between the two. One is that rage is an emotion, and grace is really a characteristic, and you can choose it a little bit more easily than you can, whereas rage is something that you kind of overcome with. But I became, really fascinated in this kind of the relationship, the dynamic the two were having with each other. And so I started to realize this kind of rhythm to it, that if rage gets people's attention, grace gets people to listen. That if rage screams for change, grace asks for it. That if rage is offensive, grace is likable. That rage is emotional, grace is sensitive, rage yells it, and grace sells it. Rage is honest, grace is artful. Rage is uncomfortable, grace is comforting, rage offends, and grace soothes. And this was a constant thing that I began to kind of realize as I was going through these case studies. That rage illuminates grace, that grace saves rage from itself, and that ultimately grace is what is rage's interpreter. So, from there I went into an actual leadership model. That's right. And I'll take you through the way this began to build. So, we have a world, and in it we have something that creates rage. And this could be a rage event like, civil rights. Like, it could be anything. I mean, in the thesis I talked about Martin Luther King and Malcolm X. It could be lack of independence. It could be something you want to change at work. The leader will swoop in and begin to activate people to try to convince them to follow. And it's grace that comes in and helps to modulate. And what happens is the relationship, let me back up a second. It's this relationship. Let me get this. Sorry. You get to see the flames again. So one thing I began to try to build this model, and I realized that they didn't work alone in a vacuum, that it wasn't two parts of a whole, that what was going on around it were these things called these partners. And these partners are the things that we come into contact during our daily lives. And it could be anything from whether family, spouse. For me, C. Blocker was a partner. But basically, these are the partners that affect, they're conditions around us that affect us, right? And Michael Porter's identified them, and thousands of people, Doug's identified them in parts of his system. And so you have to think about, I gave a place for these partners. And identified two types of partners. There's cultural partners, which are the partners we all share. So we walk outside the weather, the economy, the crisis, whatever it is. And then there's personal partners, which are the ones that are just strictly those that are your own partner. Could be your parents, could be the town you grew up in, could be a mentor, could be the color of your office. Right? So these are the personal partners. And so the way the relationship works is that it's either this will be what I would consider a healthy, or what you would identify as a healthy rage-grace relationship. But what happens is, for a lot of people, they get too overcome by rage and it becomes destructive to being a leader, or they get too overcome by too much grace and it becomes too much of a nice guy. So Al Gore, in the 2000 election, was this is his map, right? This is probably Al Gore. This is never Al Gore. But this is, in my thesis I identified Lenny Bruce, talk a little bit about Steve Jobs in a second. Leaders whose rage who creates an inability for them to lead effectively, right? So this is a question that I ask my creative teams every time they bring me work, which is, they show me an idea and I go, well, why should I care? Great, so you've got this model, why should I give a shit? Well, in the thesis I began to land on a couple basic thoughts. One is, if you want to successfully lead a creative organization, and the word creative is pivotal here. We talked about this the other day. Anytime you're putting something out in the world that didn't exist before, that's creative to me. And I'm interested in companies that are here to change things, evolve, put things in the world that didn't exist before. I think we all are. I think that's kind of why we're in this program. You also need to be aware of the partners, because you may have to cultivate. So if you've got the wrong balance of partners going, you may have to look at that and change some things. And then beyond yourself, Rage and Grace's implications in creating an effective environment and a team. So you can actually look at that world with regard to your team, and I'm going to show you a quick example. In the thesis, I touched on a couple of examples. The first one was the difference between Malcolm X as a leader and Martin Luther King. And when you looked at their models, as you did in the thesis, you saw that their partners were really the things that had contributed to maybe Martin Luther King being more successful, or Malcolm X not being able to create as much change as he wanted to. This is also an interesting example from the thesis. This is George Carlin. This is also George Carlin. And this is Lenny Bruce. And Lenny Bruce had a tremendous amount of rage and probably did as much to kick the doors down in terms of free speech. But he was his circle, his partnerships, he was a drug addict. He was abandoned as a child. He had no ability to kind of control, nor did he really have the desire to want to accomplish what George Carlin later did, which was to go on and have a very long and healthy career as a stand-up comedian. But it was his influence. When Carlin saw Lenny Bruce, he was able to repackage himself and become a more effective comedian, entertainer. There's also the example of the two Steve Jobses. The one on the left was the one who was ousted, and the one on the right is the one who came back. And in their book, Icon, they actually acknowledge that, yes, even Steve Jobs had made the transition to a world where feeling and passion could partner with business and technology. With grace and a deft touch, he whispered one last thing to the audience. I accept thanks on behalf of all the people at Apple. This was him at the 2000 Mac Expo. And then I started to think about it, of course, in terms of our world. And Bill Bernbach, who was really the guy who single-handedly began the change in advertising, was a proponent of rage in advertising, but to do it gracefully. Between Volkswagen, Avis, what idiot changed the Chivas Regal bottle? He ushered in this idea, and of course, nobody's done it, quite to the level that Nike has. And I want to show this spot. This was the second Michael Jordan spot that ever ran after Will You Believe a Man Can Fly. And it's actually, Nike has a history of playing the Rage Grace chords quite well. And so this is a great spot. I just want to play this and talk about it for a second. If it'll play.
On September 15th, Nike created a revolutionary new basketball shoe. On October 18th, the NBA threw them out of the game. Fortunately, the NBA can't stop you from wearing them. Air Jordans from Nike.
What's amazing is the context around it. You know, up until now, people had only ever worn white basketball shoes. Nike came out with this shoe, which was really, you know, a lot of people felt a racial jab on the part of Jordan, or on the part of against basketball, and the NBA banned it. And I think what's brilliant in that copy is they say they can keep him from wearing it, but they can't keep you from wearing it. And so they're kind of rallying this kind of crowd of people on this thought. And I just to talk about Nike a little bit. They really, as I said, their history is in doing this, being able to play this Rage Grace thing pretty well. I mean, they were, from the time this is their first athlete, which the Romanians probably know, Ilie Nastase. And he was the bad boy of tennis. And so when he came in, he was basically the first athlete they signed. Then they signed McEnroe. Then they've done this along the way with Revolution, Agassi, the Y2K spot they ran in the year 2000. I'm sure the Europeans know this, Mark. Tiger Woods done it perfectly here with taking what was a graceful game and bringing passion and rage into it. And just to kind of wrap up, this is I want to show you what happens when they take something that's full of rage and bring grace into it. This is Nike SB, which is their skate line. And after this, we'll show you a quick model real quick. But this is a recent spot that just broke. Okay, so let's just do this real quick. Show you how this model works for Nike SB. So you have a culture of anti-establishment. This is a skating culture. Outlaws, the entry of extreme sports, Tony Hawk, who's kind of mainstreamed it up a little bit. What's happened now is the creativity of skate, which is now it's not about just going, jumping and all that. It's like now it's about how artful you can be on your board and the creative culture that exists. Underneath that, with Nike, you have other Nike athletes, their ability, their reputation with style and technology, and then this guy Paul Rodriguez and other skate athletes that they bring in. And they do manage to kind of take what was something that was considered to be more rageful and bring grace in it. Obviously the music and the way they kind of treat all of this stuff gives you an indication of how they play this. But this is, I just wanted to apply the model onto something that was maybe a little bit different than we've seen. And then real quick, we talked about this in the first module. You brought up the Phil Jackson example way back when. And if you're thinking about building a team, I thought this was an interesting look. You have the Chicago Bulls of the 90s, and you had a culture where you had the city of Chicago that hadn't won anything. You had the Detroit Pistons, you had years of struggle, you had the Knicks, you had Bird and Magic, and then in comes Michael Jordan and Phil Jackson. And the partners that Jackson and Jordan, or Jackson and Reisendorf brought in to kind of create the tension that led to a balance of rage and grace is what to me was interesting. So you had guys like Scottie Pippen and B.J. Armstrong, and then on the other hand you had Horace Grant and then Dennis Rodman. So what I thought was interesting is in building a team, literally this is one kind of team, but in building your team at work, that there's something to consider here with this model in terms of like being able to kind of create an environment where you have this tension that exists. And that's kind of where I kind of ended up. This is my parting thought. I had one other thing that came to mind when Maurizio was doing his presentation yesterday, and that was the difference between rage and grace when it came to that very poster as a piece of communication. And we can sit here and say that Shepard Fairey didn't think about that, but an artist thinks about every decision they make. And from the choice of the tone of the color that he used in the calming blue as opposed to the typical, red, white, blue of the American flag, I thought was like a very interesting tension. And I think, Obama carries the rage-grace thing very well. So, and that's it. And you guys, next year, can you get a fan, please? That is like ridiculous.